So I wanted to start by talking about a story that has to do with Utah. So there's a writer, his name is Alain de Botton, and he wrote a book called Religion for Atheists. And on his book tour, he decided that he was not going to go to Utah. He figured that there were far too many Mormons, that there would be too many people that would be not interested in what he had to say on this topic. And so we can imagine the surprise when he found out that his book was actually selling 8 times as many copies in Utah than any other state. And so what this signifies to me is that there are a lot of potential divides here in this state when it comes to beliefs. And this talk is about how to bridge those divides, how to close the gaps between those who believe and those who disbelieve. And it's not necessarily stridently along those lines. It could even just be a more progressive form of belief in whatever belief system. It's just how do we bridge those divides? And the core of the thought is that there's something within ancient Greek philosophy that I think that we can hold on to that can kind of serve as something as a middle ground that can help us in those relationships that we have where we disagree with somebody about these tense topics. And the idea is centered in truth, beauty, and goodness. So this is a thought that came from Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and kind of carried through other Greek thinkers, carried to Roman thinkers, carried throughout the ages, and is still around, but not as pronounced as I think it should be. So the basic idea here is that truth is intellectual exercise. That's how we get closer to truth. Since they're all ideals, truth, beauty, and goodness, we can never fully reach them, but we can draw closer. So truth, we get to truth by reading, writing, discussion, debate, and teaching. And beauty is what might be called mindfulness or spiritual exercise, where we get closer to it through meditation, singing songs, expressing gratitude, being in nature, creating art, and experiencing art. Goodness would be social exercise, meeting together in communities, and coming up with meaningful social connections. So you have truth, beauty, and goodness, intellectual mindfulness or spiritual exercise, and then social exercise. We might say it's the head, the heart, and the hands, or thinking, feeling, and doing. Now the point here is that the important thing is that we have to balance these things, and it's pretty easy to fall out of balance. So it's easy to say, oh yeah, we should all pursue truth, beauty, and goodness. That sounds good. That sounds very happy, just to leave it at that. But in reality, it's not simple, and it's actually very difficult to find balance. But before I get into that, I wanted to talk a little bit more about truth, beauty, and goodness and kind of define them a little bit more fully. So when it comes to truth, truth is often uncomfortable because we find things that we thought were one way and we discover that they're actually not that way. An example, I remember the first time, well, not the first time, the only time, the time I learned how babies were made. So it was definitely uncomfortable. I'm sitting in 5th grade music class, and my friend, out of the blue, as far as I can remember, I don't remember any context for him asking me this question. But he just asked me point blank, like, do you know how babies are made? And I was like, yeah, of course I know. Like, you have to get married, and then you have to kiss each other. And he laughed at me, and I was like, yeah, that's it. How do you think? And I was like, and when he told me, I knew he was right. And I bore you or perhaps excite you about the details. But after he said it, I was like, oh, okay. And it became a theme as I'm looking back through my life, recognizing that I've been wrong about many things. In fact, just this year, I learned that tonsils are actually not the thing that's hanging down from the back of your mouth. Tonsils are the things on both sides of the mouth. And I had taught at the Brigham Young University Writing Center for a full year before I knew the difference between its and ITS and IT apostrophe S. And so there's so many things that I've come to recognize that I'm just a resigned ignoramus. Like I just don't know that much about the world, and there's so many things to learn, and I'm going to be embarrassed again and again as I try to figure out, well, what is true? So truth can be very uncomfortable, and for this reason, there's been a lot of animosity toward the truth over history. So the history of civilization is kind of the history of dictators versus all the powerless. And so you see this right at the dawn of civilization. You see it in Egypt with the pharaohs. You see it Babylonian kings, where like 1% or fewer, maybe even one person has all the power, and all the people beneath them kind of do what the king says, or they get their head cut off. Right? That's been the way that history has kind of unfolded. And the kings, those in power, get to decide what is true, or they consult an oracle. And they say, this is the truth. And if you don't agree, you're dead, right? But something changed in one city, and it changed in the city of Athens. In the city of Athens, ancient Greece, it was the first pure democracy. And what it opened up was that the truth didn't have to be confined to the single person in power or the group of people in power. The truth could actually come from anybody. And so open up the way for plays, disagreements with the powerful, open mockery of the powerful, discussion, debate. It's the first place that the study of rhetoric came from, where truth was about how could you articulate what the truth was. And whoever could come up with the best argument, people would say, oh, actually, that is the way the world works. It's not just somebody declaring that's the way the world works. You had to actually debate and argue for truth. But all wasn't well. We know that Socrates was killed because the people said, oh, he's leading people away from the gods. And so they voted to have Socrates drink the hemlock and killed Socrates. And Plato kind of saw what had happened with the mob mentality, and Plato was thinking, okay, actually, I'm not a big fan of democracy. We should actually have philosopher kings be in charge, because we want the smart people to say this is the truth. We don't want it to be free-for-all, because look what happens when it's a free-for-all. Socrates gets killed. And so eventually you see this democratic ideal kind of falling away, and you see the Roman Republic turn into the Roman Empire, and it kind of fizzles out. And it goes back to the powerful and all the people beneath. And then you see what in the West we call the Dark Ages happen, but that's not the case in the East. In the East, it was the Islamic Golden Age, where Islamic scholars kind of took what the Greek philosophers had been talking about, and they came up with very democratic societies in Spain and elsewhere where they had open discussion. It was only the Dark Ages in the Roman Catholic Empire. And so you see in around the 1300s a rediscovery of these ancient ideas, and leading as people in Italy found more Greek and Roman philosophy, that they were able to open up the way for democracy again, slowly, little by little. And in 1644, this is kind of paving the way right before the United States were founded, John Milton, he was a poet, and he would get censored. He didn't quite like being censored. And so he made a political tract that argued for truth just being put to the test. He said, just let us debate. And if we can debate, then truth will win out in the end. He said, whoever knew truth put to the worse in a free and open encounter. So that's a little bit of the story of truth. You see it come into freedom of speech in the U.S., and today we have relatively healthy debates. Maybe very relatively. But the idea is that truth comes through argument and through discussion and deliberation, and it makes people uncomfortable. Now, beauty is actually something of the opposite in that regard. Beauty feels really good, when we experience beauty. And I can just think of one example. I was on a scout camp once that has really stuck with me. We had this exercise. I don't know who invented this exercise, but we each had these round chips of wood that we had in our hands, just one each. And we all stood around this campfire, and we were supposed to think of somebody really important to us in our lives and explain who they were and explain why we were grateful for them. And then we threw the chip of wood in the fire. And we each did that, and it was very, very emotional. If you can think of somebody who is really important to you and having those vulnerable feelings exposed to a group of scouts, ended up being a very powerful experience. And then we kind of all sat around the campfire in silence afterward, and we just kind of let the emotions wash over us. That's what beauty is like. Now, at the end of a man named Wayne Booth, at the end of his life, he wrote this list of things that he felt brought him what he called temporary blissful centerings. And he said that this is what mattered most in his life. He was just about to die, and he looked back and he said, these are the moments that mattered most. And I've just captured a few of them here. But this list has been incredibly important to me because it helps me center. It's easy to get distracted from beauty and from feeling generosity. So he lists these things. He said these things brought him beauty. Loving my lifelong partner, cuddling a newborn child or grandchild, playing games with children, with friends, with anybody who is fully engaged with the game, listening to powerful music, playing music, looking at a flower or a shimmering lake or a magnified photo of an insect or a rainbow flash from a prism, feeling a flood of gratitude. This is what it means to feel beauty. And finally, I'll talk about goodness, and then I'll talk about the balance as well. So goodness is about the organization, and religions tend to do this very well, having order, having organization, getting people to come together and meet in groups. So the basic idea is that we all know that we should be good. We all know that we should be kind. We all know that we should give more. But it's good to have reminders, right? To change our habits, to keep hearing that over and over again. We should give more. It's easy to get distracted and totally forget that. And so that's one advantage to having a group where you can have some reminders. So let's talk about the balance, and this is really where we can kind of close the gap between believers and non-believers. First, we see truth without beauty and truth without goodness. So truth without beauty is cynical, and it's what happens when a person, for instance, learns a bunch of academic facts, and then they become very smug about knowing those facts, and they kind of hold it over other people and saying, "Oh, you don't know those facts. How could you not know?" And they make a big deal about it, and they hurt other people as a result. This might be somebody who learns truths about a certain religion and then uses it as a bludgeon to hurt other people. Then truth without goodness is lonely. So this is the story of Stephen Daedalus in a book, Portrait of the Artist of the Young Man. And he had this experience where he found out that his religious upbringing wasn't true. He was an Irish Catholic, and he then decided that he was going to strike out completely on his own. And on his mother's deathbed, she asked him to pray for her, and he refused. And she kept asking him, "Please, will you please do this?" And he kept refusing. And then later on in the story, after she dies, he starts feeling this regret. He starts thinking like, "Man, I don't believe that, but why would I treat my mother so cruelly in that moment?" Then we see beauty without truth. Beauty without truth is gullible. It's believing that feelings are associated with truth, rather than recognizing that Truth can feel very uncomfortable, and it has no bearing on what is true. And then beauty without goodness is selfish. It feels good, but it doesn't give back. And finally, goodness without truth is harmful. This is privileging community over skepticism. It's what happened at its very worst. This is the People's Temple, where Drink the Kool-Aid comes from. This community had come together, and they were ecstatic about being part of this community, but there was no healthy sense of skepticism within the group. And as things kept getting weirder and weirder, they didn't stop and question. They just kept up with the fervor of the group to the point where they drank the Kool-Aid, right? It was a mass suicide. And those who survived, once they saw what happened, they snapped out of it, and they were thinking, whoa, what in the world happened there? Why did we get so caught up in that? It's because there was a pursuit of goodness as they understood it without a healthy sense of intellectual skepticism. And finally, this is the last one, goodness without beauty is just bland. It's service with a grimace. So let's break into discussion after this, but the basic idea is that the key to a quality of life is to be in the center. And this is where Oasis's principle that people are more important than beliefs really stands out. Because if we're pursuing truth, beauty, and goodness, then we can say, okay, we have disagreements of belief, sure, but I value my relationship with you more than being strident about my beliefs and letting that cause a difference between us. So you might say, well, I don't have anything in common when it comes to truth with somebody who disagrees with my belief. But there's always something you can find in terms of reading your favorite books, talking about your favorite books, intellectual, political discussions. You know, if you happen to disagree about religion, maybe you agree about politics. If you can find the angle that you actually do agree when it comes to truth, then you can make that more pronounced rather than have it be divisive. In addition, you might say that you could unite around beauty. So you might say, well, I no longer pray, but you can still express gratitude. Like maybe, for instance, you might say, each morning my spouse and I are going to think of 3 things that we're grateful for, or I'm going to proactively write down or create a gratitude journal. I'm going to nurture that sense of beauty in my life through camping, through singing, etc. And then you can also unite around goodness. You might not have the exact same community, but perhaps you could choose like the Food and Care Coalition or school or PTA. You can find some form of community where you actually do still have common ground with the person that you're in disagreement with. So while it might seem a bit glib, and it is because these tensions can be very hard at times to overcome, the point is that if we can very consciously think of where we do have commonality when it comes to truth, beauty, and goodness, we can keep the relationship thriving to some degree. We all have points where we have to compromise with every single human being that we interact with. And it can be very difficult to find that compromise. I can speak for just myself in saying that the most beautiful moments of my life are the moments where I can kind of let go of my hard grip on my beliefs and open myself up to the possibility of being wrong, the possibility that I can experience beauty with somebody that I might not have been able to in the past, and that I can experience, that I can have a healthy sense of goodness with those even that I disagree with. Thanks.